Take a look at a stretch of land in northern Alaska, roughly the size of the entire state of Indiana. In 1923, President Warren Harding set this land aside for one very specific reason: to guarantee the U.S. Navy would always have oil in an emergency. It is called the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, and at 23 million acres, it is the single largest piece of public land the federal government owns anywhere in the country. Geologists estimate it holds close to 900 million barrels of oil and more than 50 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And here's the strange part. More than 100 years after it was created specifically to be drilled, most of this reserve has never produced a single barrel. Here is an even stranger fact to sit with while we get into this. The land was set aside before anyone had ever flown a commercial airplane across the country, before television existed, and it has sat there through the entire history of modern oil drilling technology, mostly just waiting. So why did America set aside land the size of an entire state specifically for oil, and then barely touch it for a century? A reserve built for battleships. To understand why this land exists at all, you have to go back to the early 1900s, when the U.S. Navy was in the middle of switching its entire fleet from coal-burning ships to oil-burning ships. Military planners got nervous. What would happen if the country ran out of oil during a war? So the government started setting aside massive blocks of land specifically as emergency fuel stockpiles, first in California and Wyoming, at sites like Teapot Dome, a name that would later become infamous for an entirely different reason involving a corruption scandal. And then, in 1923, the largest one of all in northern Alaska, originally called Naval Petroleum Reserve No. 4. At the time, almost nobody had actually surveyed this land in detail. Officials knew oil was likely down there because of natural oil seeps bubbling up along the coast. But the exact size of the prize was still a total mystery, hidden beneath frozen ground that very few people had ever even walked across. The land that's bigger than you think. Just how big is this reserve? At 23 million acres, it covers about 37,000 square miles, which makes it roughly the size of Indiana, or bigger than the states of West Virginia or South Carolina put together with room to spare. It sits right next door to Prudhoe Bay, the massive oil field discovered in 1968 that turned Alaska's economy upside down almost overnight. But here's the twist. Prudhoe Bay was actually found just outside the reserve's boundary, practically next door to land the government had already earmarked for oil decades earlier. The reserve itself, despite being set aside specifically to secure oil for the country, ended up sitting mostly untouched while its neighbor became one of the largest oil fields in North American history. An almost comical case of the government owning the right neighborhood, but drilling the wrong lot. Why almost nobody drilled it. For most of the 20th century, the reserve simply sat there under Navy control, technically off limits to commercial development because its entire purpose was to remain a backup supply, not an active oil field. That changed in 1976, when Congress transferred control to the Department of the Interior, and a few years later, formally opened the land to oil and gas leasing. You would think that's where the story turns into a boom. It didn't. Companies have leased huge sections of the reserve over the decades and then quietly walked away without drilling. In some recent years, more than half of all leases issued in the reserve were simply relinquished before a single well was drilled, largely due to years-long permitting delays, shifting regulations between different presidential administrations, and the reserve's special protected zones. One of those zones, the Teshekpuk Lake area, is one of the richest wildlife habitats in the entire Arctic, home to caribou herds, grizzly bears, and hundreds of thousands of migratory birds every summer, and it has been repeatedly placed off limits to drilling to protect exactly that ecosystem. The project that finally broke the pattern. The one major exception to a century of near inactivity is the Willow project, which actually sits inside the reserve's boundaries. First approved in 2020, temporarily blocked by a court that found flaws in its environmental review, then reapproved after a new review process, Willow is now under construction and expected to produce its first oil later this decade. At peak production, it's projected to add up to 180,000 barrels of oil a day, a genuinely significant number for American energy supply, and proof that oil can, in fact, still be pulled out of a reserve that has spent 100 years mostly just sitting there. Why this matters right now? Here's the bigger picture fact that makes this reserve worth paying attention to again today. Alaska's oil production overall has been declining for decades, and the massive Trans-Alaska Pipeline that carries nearly all of the state's oil south to market needs a certain minimum flow just to keep functioning properly in the cold. Every new barrel that comes from projects like Willow helps keep that entire system alive, which means this century-old reserve, created for a Navy that no longer even needs it for that original purpose, may end up playing a real role in America's energy supply after all, a full 100 years after it was first set aside and then almost immediately forgotten. So here sits the largest piece of public land in the entire United States, originally reserved for battleships that stopped needing coastal oil stockpiles decades ago, holding hundreds of millions of barrels confirmed beneath the surface, and for most of the last 100 years, almost completely untouched. Companies have leased it, walked away from it, fought over it in court, and protected large chunks of it for the wildlife that calls it home. And now, one single project inside its boundaries might finally prove that the reason nobody drilled here for a century was never really about the oil. It was about everything standing in the way of it. If you want to see more of this, please like and subscribe.